All right. So we're all present here on kind of in preparation for our spring freshet together, and kind of looking forward today to be talking to local residents in the Britannia area. So of course you're all welcome to chip in with any questions you have as we're working through these slides. And so what about the flow regulation when we talk about, these primary reservoirs? And so there are 13 principal reservoirs in the system. And really it's only through the use of the judicious use of these reservoirs that any sort of flow regulation occurs. There are lots of other structures in the system. We'll talk about those, but those don't really affect flow and in terms of mitigating flooding. And so these are the primary ones. So these are large bodies of water that store available. They have available storage that's available every year to store, and at times then later in the season they release rainwater and snowmelt runoff. And flow regulation then is essentially that work of either making decisions to retain water, and that occurs in the springtime, or perhaps later to release more water to help mitigate drought levels in the summertime period. And once again, an emphasis on that 1983 agreement, that it's really about managing these 13 reservoirs in an integrated and cooperative manner. Now, specifically for you folks in the Britannia Reach and Lac de Chêne, really it's the sector to the west. In this particular slide, it's highlighted in white. It's only this area that drains down through. But really, this is a very significant area. Obviously, it's over half of the Ottawa River basin drains through this particular sector. And you can see we've got a wide variability in the amount of flow or the peak flow that occurs every year. We can have a peak flow as low as 1,700 cubic meters per second. And we've seen, and this was, of course, the record that occurred last year, that we were almost up to 6,000 cubic meters per second. So we've got a wide variation in the amount of flow that happens. And it's dependent, of course, on what nature brings us every year in terms of what those flood peak volumes will be. Sure. Yeah, so this is the flow rate at Lac de Chêne. The flow rate at Carleton is over 9,000. Like in 2019, our peak flow was over 9,000. So obviously, in a year like 2019, a significant portion of the snowmelt runoff and rainfall that occurred led to really the majority of the water coming from these sectors. Now, every year we've got variations in what occurs naturally, and for residents along the river, they're familiar with the variation in water levels, the seasons that change, and of course, what's primary interest right now is what's happening on the ground, and what are the factors that can affect or increase or decrease risk in the system. And so what this slide is talking about then is factors in the basin that have an impact upon how large a flood can be in any particular year. And so we can see that snowpack absolutely is a risk factor, but it's not a determining factor. If we have more snow, there's a potential for more snowmelt runoff, but it's dependent then on some of these other factors. Such as an early spring. If we have an early spring like we have this year, we tend to have the snowmelt that's slower, that is less substantial, and so we benefit from an early spring. Of course, if we have more rainfall, that's an increased risk factor. If we have a high average precipitation, increased risk. We can have, because we have such a large basin, we can have storms that come and precipitation that's received in different sectors. If this occurs over where the reservoirs are in the northern sectors, we don't necessarily see an increase in flow. But if it happens in an unregulated portion of the basin, we have increased risk. And then there are factors on the ground. If we've got a large snowpack and we receive rainfall, it tends to act like a sponge and it's absorbed. And so there's kind of not a real impact in those times. But when we've got bare ground that's frozen, the snow melt or the runoff is quite high. And so we're really, throughout the spring period, we're very, very susceptible to weather patterns, where that rainfall or snowfall or warming occurs. And because it's such a large basin, things that are happening in far off sectors can have an effect locally. And so then trying to speak to that natural variability, we just have taken a natural tributary of the Ottawa, and the Ottawa River is well known. It's it's a feeder out of the Algonquin Park, and so we know there aren't any particular structures there or any kind of man-made changes to the flow of the river. And so we see that typically we remain in the green zone. About 50% of the time the flow levels can be found in those zones. And historically, if we look back in the past, we see that there have been certainly high peaks on the Ottawa River. And we've got a pretty long period of record, 1915 to date. So we've got about almost 105 years of record. So a good long record. And so some of the natural variability that we see just year to year. 2017, pretty high year. The peak was fairly late. It was well into May before it peaked. With a few, we can see that there's a rainfall event in June. Some variability. A year like 2010, for various reasons, the snowpack was quite low, no springtime precipitation. The peak flow out of the Petawawa, very, 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 very low, almost peaking only just slightly over 100. 2017, flood year on many sectors. We had very large rainfall events, and we see that reflected where we have these two very large peaks, almost historic peaks, and of course with a large volume that was high for a long period of time. And then we have 2019. 2019 was 46, almost 50% higher than the previous peak, which was in 1986, I believe, or excuse me, 85. It's written right there. And so we see there's just this natural variability in the system. Now, some of the kind of the initial questions that people are having this year is we realize it's an early spring. What's going to happen this year? What, is this detrimental or what can I expect? And so once again, graphically, we're showing levels for Britannia, and 50% of the time we can observe that levels are found in this zone, we can say. And we see that typically it's only towards the end of March that levels on average begin to rise. And we see that typically it's the end of April where we achieve our peak. And so this year things have begun a little bit earlier, but we can see that on average we're quite close to what occurs every year. And so just to give some context, we can look at a year like 2010 where we're coming in right at the average, and we had a bit of an increase in late March, but then seasonal effects, very low snowpack, not much precipitation, led to a very low spring peak. We have 2019. 2019, as we're looking in March, flows were quite low. Reservoirs had been emptied for a long period, and we were waiting for spring to begin. And so it's really not until we're into the late in the first week of April that kind of any melt begins, and we have the resultant highest on record. And here we are this year. We've been much the same coming in at average, but we've seen that we've got things have been started a little bit earlier, which in many ways is very good. We've seen snow disappearing in our southern regions very early this year, and in the same way then flows locally are picking up. These are the initial rise in the lake has been from just local flows, the flows out of the north. There's no kind of increase from these upper tributaries. So this is viewed as very beneficial. We see water leaving the system early, and so it's good. So the timing to the peak, well, typically the peak is about 4 weeks away from when that initial thaw begins, but we can see that there are variations every year. Every year is different. We don't know how this year will play out. We don't know what our precipitation is going to be. We don't know how quickly it's going to warm. And all of these are then the factors that are unseen and will affect what comes for 2020. So for the Lac du Chêne sector, really, as we showed on a previous slide, it's only the dams in the western portion of the basin that have any importance, and really it's those dams in the Abitibi-Témiscamingue region, the Dozwa, Rapid-Set, Cairns, Lady Evelyn, Témiscamingue, Chippewa. These are the primary storage areas that are available to you. You can see the arrow that one pointing west and one pointing east, and that's the divide. And essentially, that's the point where the river either flows west or east. And so really the Dozwa is the top of the Ottawa River, and it flows west through to Lake Témiscamingue, and then begins kind of a long southeast trajectory down through southern regions, eventually through Lake du Chêne, and then to the outlet at Québec-Carleton Dam. So operationally for these reservoirs, typically they're operated, all of them, in a very similar fashion. The winter period is a period of drawdown. We head into winter, really reservoirs are full at the end of December, early January. And typically it's over a 3-month period where the water's drawn down and those reservoirs are emptied. And so there are two primary things that are going on. The reservoirs are being emptied to provide water to increase hydropower production throughout the winter period when it's most needed. And then also the reservoirs are being emptied at the same time so that then they'll be available to be refilled. And we see that typically for the end of March, reservoirs are empty. They typically fill quite quickly as the reservoirs or storage volume is used to hold back water from more southern regions. And then levels remain typically very stable through the summer period as the reservoirs are used primarily for recreational purposes during the summer and the fall periods. Now, when we talk about flow regulation, we talk about the use of the storage of those reservoirs. And so this talks about those Abitibi-Témiscamingue reservoirs. And once again, the green band represents where 50% of the time, this is where the storage volume would be found. And so this is taking all of the storage combined and kind of aggregating it together. So we can see that on an average year, we get about a little over 5 billion cubic meters of water stored every year. And we can see that pattern of by the end of the March, the reservoirs are empty and ready to be refilled. They're refilled quickly in the spring period and then remain fairly stable throughout the rest of the year. Now, we've been out into the community asking or responding to many questions, and really, I think for most of you, the questions that you should be asking and need to have answered, is the storage that's available being effectively used? Is what's there being used properly and in a timely fashion? And then, is that reservoir storage being used in any way that kind of is detrimental to me while it benefits somebody else? And so those are things that you should have clear answers to and have a good feel about. And so I'm kind of returning then to the operations of those reservoirs. We looked earlier about reservoir storage that's available above Lake Duchesne, and this time we've got a maximum and minimum of historic values on the graph as well, and then we are also illustrating the amount of storage that was available in 2019, and then where we are this year in 2020. And so we can see that, part of the operation that's done every year is that reservoirs are emptied, and so the volumes are at a minimum. And we see then that in 2019, we've had that late spring, and so reservoirs were emptied, and then the reservoirs were just waiting for that spring to arrive. And then spring arrived quite late, about almost into the third week of April, and then we see that sharp increase in storage volume, the use of that storage volume. Now, part of giving a historical comparison is that it's to illustrate that there's been no change in how the reservoirs are operated. This is something that's done every year. It's standard operating procedures for reservoirs to be emptied and for them to be filled. And so people should have confidence that the storage that's available is been fully made available, and then it's used in an appropriate fashion when it's required. Just to speak a little bit to 2020, we're currently below average in terms of overall reservoir storage, and reservoirs are just in that waiting mode, waiting for the spring freshet to begin. So there was a question then about the use of the reservoir storage and why it never actually goes down to zero. And so part of it is the limitations on the reservoirs themselves. Temiskaming, which is an important reservoir in the system, the last one on the system, is currently fully open. What happens is that as the lake level lowers, you begin to approach a point where the level the water that can go out also decreases. So the dam has been fully open for a period of 3 weeks, and there's just no more water that can go out. And this is typical of most of the reservoirs. And so the only time that they ever go down lower is when there have been multi-year droughts. So kind of year over year, the levels are very low, and then the levels were able to go down. But as we can see, the difference between the historic minimum and where we are currently is quite small. And in terms of overall volume in the system, there's not really much benefit. So it's very typical then, this kind of operation. People have heard perhaps in some presentations locally that there was a diversion of water that occurred in 2017. And so this is a graphic of the basin, and if you can notice once again right up at the headwaters of the Ottawa, there's the Kabonga Reservoir and the Dozwa. Now the Kabonga has the ability to open a diversion that allows water to pass into the Ottawa River. And this diversion is actually used annually, and what it is used for is that because there are more power plants, more hydropower plants on the main stem of the Ottawa, they divert some of the water from those northern areas to pass through the Ottawa, and it's used to generate more power. And Ontario Power Generation actually pays for that water because it's a benefit to the system. but that diversion occurs only in periods of low flow. Now, what happened in 2017 is that during the peak of events, it was proposed to divert water from the Kabonga into the other system. And this was done, and it was diverted into the Dozwa. And so we can see here it was about 74 meters cubed for a period of about 10, 11 days. And what happens is this water then goes into the Ottawa and into the Dozwa. Now, we can see that the number of days travel between the 2 points is quite different, and that's why this water was diverted, is that the water that goes into the Gatineau River from the Kabonga, it takes only 6 days to travel down and to affect the Ottawa area. And this, of course, occurs below Lake Deschênes down in the Gatineau, Ottawa region. But if it's put into the upper Ottawa River, it takes 21 days. It's 3 weeks of travel time for that water to move through the system. So, given that flooding was already peaking at kind of on the system in the southern areas, it was deemed that this 3-week travel time would then have no effect during peak level, during the period of the peak at the more southern locations. And so this 74 meters cubed was diverted and over some 11 days. Now it's diverted into the Dozwa, and the Dozwa, the largest reservoir in the system, its discharge is set to 0. During you can look now on our website and observe that the flow from the Dozwa during the high flow periods is 0 throughout the whole extent of the freshet period. And so when this water was first diverted, the flow of the Dozwa was at 0. The Dozwa was open during this period, later in the period, but then it's 21 days to reach these southern sectors. And so we can see that by the time that water of some 75 cubic meters approximately reaches the south, the flooding's well past on the southern reaches. But also the amount of water is very small in terms of flow volume. Down in the Lake Deschênes region, the peak flow was about 5,500 in 2017. So as a percentage increase, it's very small. And when it occurred, it was well past when the peak had occurred in these southern reaches. And so when that water arrived some 3 weeks later, we can estimate it would have been about 4% of a flow that was down to about 3,000 by the time it reached there. And the benefit then was more immediate for those who were being very detrimentally flooded on the lower reach, the people in Cumberland and in Hawkesbury, these reaches, these areas, they received benefit within about 6 days. So that's why the operation was done. No particular questions? I guess I know that we do have some general questions on reservoir operations. And you can observe and watch reservoir operations very closely on our website, where it's we go back to currently to 2017, where you can look at the operations of reservoirs throughout. And some of the really keen observers in the system are asking some very good questions. And some observe that some of these reservoirs aren't fully emptied. And why is that? And there are certain locations, such as the Kabonga, the Michilimackinac, the Kiamika, Lady Evelyn, even the Dozwa, where the area that these reservoirs are holding water back from, the reservoir volume that they can contain is much larger than the flow that occurs every year. So if we say that, I'll just use a nice round number, that there's 100 billion cubic meters that flows in a typical freshet into a reservoir, well, these reservoirs perhaps would have 1.5 times that, 150 million cubic meters capacity. And so if we look at the discharge from these reservoirs throughout, much like the Dozwa, these reservoirs, their discharges are at zero or at an environmental minimum for the whole period of the freshet. And so when we talk about flow regulation, some of these areas there's no real regulation going on at all, in that the reservoirs are set to zero discharge throughout the spring period. And so there are only certain specific reservoirs where we know we reach capacity, that the reservoir regulation is much more difficult and of course needs to be watched very closely. Now this is a graph that talks about the history that we have observed on Lake Deschênes, and we've got a pretty good long history. It's almost 100 years of recorded history in terms of levels on Lake Deschênes. We can divide some of the time on the basin in terms of kind of pre-1954 being a time of building of dams and reservoirs, but really by 1954 all of the major structures are in place. And then we can observe that in 1983 that was the creation of the board and its various elements. One of the things too kind of we can just see in general is that we've had certainly major floods throughout the years. We can see 1928, 51, 1960, 79, and then of course 2017, 2019 being the largest among them, but still at kind of regular intervals we have experienced large floods. Now there are limits to that flow regulation, and we've talked about the regulated and unregulated portions of the basin. And so typically flooding occurs when we've got too much water, obviously too much water, and that's when the spring runoff is greater than what's in those reservoirs. And flooding also occurs when there's runoff in those unregulated areas. And so there can be at times a mixture of those factors. Some years it's one story and some years it's another. Always, every year, there are different factors at play. But something that happens every year is that the flooding duration is always reduced through the use of the reservoirs. And in many years, as we've seen in the last number of decades, we haven't had any significant flooding, and it's part of the role of those reservoirs to reduce the peaks that occur. And that's what the graphic on the right speaks about, is that really every year the flood peaks are reduced through the use of this reservoir volume. Let's just talk a little bit then about the types of structures, because, locally people see dams and they associate dams with reservoirs. But it's important to kind of identify the difference between the two. A reservoir has significant capacity to store water, and so we've been talking about that northern 40%, and that's what these reservoir dams are. Then we can talk about run-of-river dams, and these are typically dams that are down on the main stem of the Ottawa River. They don't have a large volume upstream that they can utilize during spring flooding in terms of trying to store water. And so when flows are high, essentially these dams are just passing the flows that arrive from upstream. So what determines flooding in my area? And of course we're going to be very specific and talk about Lake Deschênes. The biggest factor in terms of what affects local levels and flows, it's what's coming from upriver. What's going on in the tributaries above me, what's going on in the snowmelt or the rainfall that's upstream of me. And then what limits water from flowing out of my area? Every area on the river has its own unique characteristics. what are the constriction points below me? What are the constriction points that affect me? And this is a dynamic that's played out in many areas on the river. From Mattawa all the way down to Tédillon, we can see that there are particular points of constriction that limit the amount of water, the passage of water that can go through. An analogy that we often use is talking about these areas is similar to a funnel, that we're familiar with a funnel that if you try and pour too much water through it, there's only a certain amount that will go through the narrowing, and so then you have a backing up effect above the narrows. We can see that the water, where is it coming from? It's coming from upstream through the Shaw's Lake Reach, through the Shaw Falls Dam, and then the constraint or the limitation on flow out of this particular sector is the Duchesne Rapids. And so those are the two primary elements to be looking at as kind of you go through any seasonal fluctuations, is how much water is coming in and then how much water is leaving. And so to deal or speak to more directly even those downstream operations, there's just no influence on Lake Duchesne from downstream operations. We've got a picture here of the ring dam. During the flood periods, the ring dam is fully open. There's nothing operationally that goes on there that can affect levels. There's a significant drop in elevation between the levels on Lake Duchesne and locally at the ring dam. It's a drop of 4 meters to above, and then it's a drop of 20 meters as we go even further downstream, even just in front of Parliament Hill. So there's just a significant drop in level. There's no influence downstream to upstream. So no downstream operator can lower, unfortunately, levels. Those levels, that outflow constriction is a fixed variable that is determined by the constraint at Duchesne Rapids. And so the only way then to reduce levels on Lake Duchesne during flooding periods is for that holding back of water to decrease the upstream flow to the maximum extent that's possible. Now this graphic then begins to talk about how much water is flowing through the system, and specifically past the residents of Lake Duchesne. So what we've seen on the last graphic, typically from empty to full in the Abitibi-Témiscamingue reservoirs, it's a little over 5 billion cubic meters stored. On a typical year, the amount of water that's going to flow by a resident on Lake Duchesne, it's about 2.3 times that. It's a multiple of that. So the storage is only a small factor in terms of overall runoff in a typical year. In a year like 2017, where we had significant flooding, unfortunately, the reservoir volume doesn't change. Empty is empty and full is full. Reservoirs were emptied much the same way that they were in 2019 and this year, but the available reservoir storage is limited. But we can see that the volume that flows through the system can be significantly larger. And so in 2017, it was 4 times larger than reservoir storage. And then if we look at 2019, it's over 4 times the volume of available storage. And this is just for the period April 1st to June 6th. And the reason it was done for this period is that it's a period that aligns quite well with when waters were high in 2017. So it makes for a good comparison between those 2 years and for what occurs historically. Now this graph, I'm going to attempt to speak a little bit to the timing, or are there benefits to others over and above me and my location. And this is the forecast table, and unfortunately many people are familiar with this document. It was issued close to 50 times in 2019, and it speaks, of course, to the forecast peak levels. Now this is one that's occurring later in the year. We're kind of May 7th, where peaks have already occurred on the system. And so we can see that in kind of in the yellow or gold colored sectors where we see on Lac Shaw, Lake Duchesne, down on the more southerly reach in the Gatineau-Holt or so, down to Grenville-Hawkesbury region. We can see that within a matter of days, the system has already peaked. They're peaking almost at the same time. Now, the instrument that is used to mitigate downstream flooding, there's only one instrument available, and that's the reservoir storage. So that water that's being held back, it's all being reduced throughout the whole system. So if you're holding back water at Lake Timiskaming, you're holding back water for Mattawa and then down through the system. And for those who were using these every day, you would have been observing as water then is released in the second peak that we have additional flooding or waters that are arriving from upstream. And it's a matter of 3 days from Timiskaming down through the Britannia area. And it's easily to kind of survey and watch the influence of water as it flows through the system. And so there's just no benefit of one location over another. The timing is essentially the reservoir storage is being applied to the whole system all at the same time. And so then southern locations, the levels peak within a number of days of one another. The mitigating factor is the northern reservoirs, and so that's applied essentially at the same time throughout the system to everyone. So the question then was over what the peak levels, and so yes, in this we can see kind of this in this first forecast, this May 7th forecast. We see the peaks for the first peak. There were two peaks. The second peak was lower in the southern regions, whereas the areas that we see on the graph, in the table for the northern sectors, their peaks were larger in the second because northern waters were arriving for them. This is another illustration, and it speaks again to the effect of reservoirs locally, and speaks to how the reservoirs are being used, what the effect is locally by reservoir operations. And so if we go to the graph kind of at the end of the March, where we are currently, very typically, and where we would be this year, is what we see is that flows out of the reservoirs are about 500 cubic meters per second. That's very typical. We're about 450 currently, but the flows that are occurring locally are up around 1,500, even over 2,000 now, because we've got an early spring this year. And that's all from tributaries that are below the reservoirs. So the green shaded area and the little brown area that's Bark Lake on the Madawaska. Those are the two reservoir areas. And then the blue is the area that is contributions from the local tributaries. And that would be every tributary from the Des Moines, the Petawawa, the Coulange, the Bonnechere, the Mississippi. All these upstream tributaries contribute to the downstream flow. And so if we look then at the first peak that occurred on Lake Duchesne, what do we see? We see that 77% of the flow at the peak was coming from those local tributaries, those tributaries that are south of the reservoirs. We can see that there's been an increase from the northern reservoirs as well, but it's been quite minimal. But what we see then is that specifically during that first peak, we've got a large local flow. And so there are a few things that illustrates. It illustrates that not only do we have a volume problem, if we've got too much volume, but it's also where the reservoirs are located. In order to kind of mitigate flooding, specifically during an event like the first peak, the reservoirs would somehow have to be able to capture the flow that's coming from these tributaries that are below. So you'd have to have a reservoir, say, located in Pembroke that would capture the tributaries that are flowing into that sector, or you can imagine any location for a reservoir that would be in some way beneficial. It would have to be between those northern reservoirs and where flooding's occurring in the south. Then what we observed during the second peak is that it's in many ways kind of operationally, that's what we want to see. We want to see that in no way do the reservoir operations make flooding worse than what occurred as an overall peak. But what's happening is that the reservoirs are full and have had to begun to release water significantly. And then we see then that there's also a local portion, but the local tributary flows have been decreasing. And that's the goal of the management of the system, is that holding on to water as long as we can, waiting for those more southerly tributaries to begin to decrease before that that northern snowmelt runoff and rainfall has to be released as the reservoirs are full. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the effects of the reservoirs and the benefits of the reservoirs. And so what we have here then is that the blue line is the actual water level that occurred in 2019 on Lake Duchesne. And so we can see then we had a peak, twin occurrence of a first and a second peak. Then the line in red is what we would term a natural level. And this is what we estimate would have been the natural level without the presence of the current reservoirs. And so if we look during that January through March period, the actual levels are higher than what would have occurred naturally. And this is because the reservoirs are emptying and they're providing more downstream flow than would have occurred naturally. But we see as we get to that end of March period where the reservoirs are emptied, and then we begin to see that element of storage beginning to take place. As flows increase, the reservoirs begin to fill, and that effect of reduction or holding back water begins then to reduce the reduce the actual versus what we estimate the natural would have been. And so the benefit of the operation of the reservoirs, we estimate it to be about 3/4 of a meter. And this benefit occurs everywhere in the system. It depends where you are. The benefit can be more or less. If you're in a sector that has a very large or broad, more of a lake, then the volumes that pass are larger, and so the amount of variation is changed, and so it's smaller. But some of the narrow sections, like I'm sure some of the sectors more up in the Fitzroy Harbor area or up in the Quéant, the narrows there, the benefit would have been even more. If you didn't have the reservoirs, we could easily envision a level that would have risen a meter or more. And so this occurs every year. Every year, no matter how large the flood is or how high the peak is, the benefits from the reservoirs are always actualized because that reservoir storage is always used every year. Perhaps another question that people have been asking about is, the use of reservoirs, the use of storage of water upstream. Perhaps saying, why couldn't you lower the level upstream of me and somehow there would be a benefit? And so we're just going to use the example of Shaw's Lake, of course, because it's immediately upstream of you in the Lake Duchesne's area. And so what we have here is a graphic kind of comparing the volumes of available storage on the different reservoirs. And we see that those large reservoirs in the north, Basketong is, of course, the largest in the system, but it doesn't affect you because it's on the Gatineau, it's downstream of you. But the Dozwa, the Canes, the Temiskaming, the Chippewa, I guess the Lady Evelyn, are the primary reservoirs, and Bark Lake as well, that affect you locally. Now, if we were to perhaps try and estimate conditions on Shaw's Lake before the building of the dam, and looking at the historic record, the dam is, some 14 meters high, but the actual increase on Shaw's Lake, on average, it's about a meter. It's about 3 feet higher than it was before the dam was built. So not a significant increase in storage and on that part of the river. But if I go back in the historic record before the dam was built, I can find that the lowest April level that I could find was essentially 72.9, and it's a very low associated flow. Now, on average, in every given year, as we're heading into the spring period, we're at about 74.1. And so with just for argument's sake, let's say we've got 1.2 meters of storage, and that equates then to that little blue line over there on that graphic, and it's about 75 to 100 billion cubic meters of storage. Now, the threshold for the 13 principal reservoirs is over twice that. And so the amount of water that would be available on Shaw's Lake is quite small. And so how does that look? It would essentially take 5 days at a flow of 200 cubic meters to fill this volume. No. Now, if we look at our current flow is about 2,000. So all that we need is for flow to be at 2,200 for 5 days, and the flow of discharge held at 2,000 to fill that storage volume. Now, we know that in periods of extreme flooding, we spend weeks above 4,000. We spend weeks where our peaks down on Lake Duchesne, we've seen that we've had, our maximum flow last year in 2019 was 6,000. So the storage volume, essentially what happens is it is naturally used as flows increase in the spring. And so, all locations upstream of these dams, there's no real reservoir storage that's available, no real volume that's beneficial to downstream users. So a couple things then to conclude, and we'd like to leave with you that, flooding really is a result of what nature gives us. There's been a lot of talk about and concern this year, particularly because we've had some very large years in recent history, but there's nothing to indicate that this year will be any larger than any other year. At this time, snowpack's above the average in the north, but it's not a determining factor. And so we've got to yet wait to see what the snow melt temperatures and precipitation will bring us. But everyone should be confident that available storage is used in the same way every year. And every year there's a benefit to the system. The peaks that will be achieved this year on Lake Duchesne, it's going to be just solely dependent on how much water comes from upriver locations. But as every year, there's going to be a reduction in that peak through the use and retention of water in the upper principal reservoirs. Okay. So we encourage people, of course, to be in contact with us. There are many different ways. Particularly encourage you to be using our website. A lot of information there. We have a new updated website. Lots of information available for local users to be reviewing. And of course, you can contact us at the Secretariat if you have any particular questions or concerns.